Hello, Namaskar. Welcome to my pod, the CAA Show. CAA, as all of you know, is Conversations and Analysis. My name is Juggi Bhasin. There is a tide in the affairs of men which, taken at the flood, leads to fortune. These are famous lines by William Shakespeare. I think they were spoken by Brutus in the play Julius Caesar. What is this fortune which I'm talking about? What is this tide which I'm talking about? I'm talking about the fact that ever since President Trump was sworn in as the president of the United States 48 hours back, there is a tide going on all over the world which is changing. There is political change happening, social change happening, economic change happening, and this is leading to a change in the fortunes of so many things all at the same time. I'm going to talk about all that. But very, very quickly, just to give you a snapshot of what is happening, is that wokeism, okay, wokeism, DEI, and for those of you who did not know what DEI was, DEI stands for diversity, equity, inclusion. Wokeism, DEI, godlessness, Marxist socialism, all these are out. And what is in? What really is in right now is spirituality. The belief in religion, once again, that is in. Man is in, masculinity is in, women are in, femininity is in, and common sense is back. That is the big, big tide, the big, big change which is going on all over the world right now. I'm going to expand on all this in this podcast, but as usual, before I do that, I would urge all of you to subscribe to the CAA show. It's very, very simple, really. All you have to do is to press that red button on your screen. You subscribe to the CAA show. The subscription is, of course, completely free. And I would also really appreciate if you could like the show and share this video with your friends and your colleagues. Okay, now let's dive back into this very, very interesting development, this very, very interesting trend which is going on all over the world. But before I talk about what's happening right now, let's take a peek back into the not very, very not the past, which hasn't really gone away. It's still very much there with us, but it is kind of fading away. Let's take a look at what is happening in the last 4 years of the time when the Biden administration had taken over, and these sweeping social, economic, and military changes were happening all over the world. I'm going to give you a snapshot of that. I'm not going to take too much of time, but that will give you a context of what's happening today also. So, what really was happening, not only in America, but in Europe also, was that some kind of, you can call it, these are not terms which are devised by anyone, but I'm just giving you a terminology. Some kind of a liberal project had been launched, uh, not only for America and the Europe, but for all over the world, and especially for emerging economies like India. And what was this liberal project? This liberal project was quite literally, the idea was to disrupt the existing world order. Now, how did they do that? And they actually did that. Let's talk a little bit about that before we understand the implications of this liberal project. The first step towards that was not only the installation of these liberal governments in America and Europe, which had already happened. If you remember, there are so many governments now in Europe which are liberal minded. The Biden administration was, of course, liberal minded also. But the idea really was to install these kind of governments in other countries also, especially important countries, emerging economies like India. That was the big thing that was going on. And how would you do that? In America, they tried that by, first of all, the first step really was to introduce DEI in the workplace and the government. DEI, as I explained to you earlier, was diversity, equity, and inclusion. All this was done in name of social justice, that people, communities, ostensibly which had been suffering, which had not been given their due rights, which had been persecuted over the years, they would get preference in the workplace, especially in the government and even in the private sector. That was carried out by the previous administration in the US with full vigor and full gusto. So that was the first big step which they took to introduce a new kind of an order into the into the body politic of America. The second thing, and the very important, the critical thing which they tried to do was the emasculation. The word emasculation means a kind of a weakening. The emasculation of masculinity or of being male, even I would say the emasculation of femininity of being female, and the empowerment of new genders, of something called transgenders, of adding all these terms to LGBTQ, XYZ, whatever you want to call it, rights, etc. Now, I just want to clarify out here, I personally am a great supporter of gay rights. I think they are absolutely fine. But I can't for the life of me understand what all these trans rights and other kinds of rights which have been introduced. But that was the idea. The idea really being that break down the traditional order of men are men, women are women, and introduce new genders to sow confusion, to completely change the ethos, the social ethos, especially of people in America. Then the third step really was also, and now that is emerging at how deep this had gone into, was to change the character of the armed forces in America. Um, Now there are photographs which are coming out, there are stories which are coming out of senior generals in the US Army, in the Air Force, who were transgenders, people who are wearing dresses at work. And there were all kinds of talks and there were all kinds of lectures, mandatory. You couldn't escape that. You had to attend that were going on DEI policies in the armed forces in the US. All that is coming out now. The idea really was that it was not so much about operational readiness, but it was, and I think this point was highlighted by Hexet, who is standing, whose nomination is coming up for Secretary of Defense. He talked about all this, that this was the emphasis in the US, not so much as to how would they fight the wars or what they would do or operational readiness, as I said, but more on DEI policies to completely change the character of the armed forces in the US. And the most and along with that, there was this control of the information flow. All the tech giants, all the media giants, especially in the information business, and we know what happened to Facebook during that time, what happened to Google at that. All the satraps, all the big guns of these organizations, they were asked to toe a particular line. Zuckerberg is now a record, and he's saying that he was pressurized to censor content on Facebook. That's all now coming out now. So that was the other big step. But the biggest step which they took during this time to usher in this new world order was to break down the traditional family unit, was to was to question parental authority, was in a certain sense to make underage kids almost autonomous in thinking, sow confusions in the minds of impressionable minds, I would say, of young kids, both boys and girls, about gender, about equality, all these concepts. And as a result of that, you had a proliferation of these clinics, of proliferation of nixing gender, of questioning the gender you were born in and trying to acquire some other gender. All these experiments were carried out. They were, in fact, becoming a part of the educational criteria in schools and colleges. But the worst thing was that, well, the spirituality aspect, the God aspect, the believing in God, all those concepts were kind of shushed up, that said that we are not interested in all this. But rather, there was a questioning of the parental authority. There were more powers given to social services and outside forces who would impress on the kids at home. Quite literally, it meant the breakdown of the family unit and the creation of a new kind of a family system in America. So, in nutshell, really, what really was going on, the liberal project was to create a kind of a godless state, a pseudo Marxist socialist state, all in the name of social justice, all in the name of progress, all in the name of emancipation. All that was going on in America. It is still going on, by the way, in Europe. Many governments in Europe are still doing that, and that's why we see all those problems in the United Kingdom, in France, and so many other places, Germany. And along with this, the other project, the liberal project, also meant that the idea was to foster the same kind of policies, was to introduce the same kind of, either through the back door or through the front door, in other governments, especially, as I said, important emerging economies like India. And and therefore the deep state in these countries, especially America, was really, really working overtime to overthrow governments. We have seen the way the governments have been overthrown in our neighborhood, in the subcontinent. The Bangladesh government was overthrown. What has happened in Pakistan, we can see that. Similar attempts were made in India. The idea really being that everybody comes on the same page, on the same board, everybody starts thinking alike and accepts the liberal project, accepts this change in family and in the outer world, accept this breakdown of society to introduce, as I said, a godless Marxist socialist system. But and that's my point, or the contention which I'm making in this podcast, is all that eventually had to fail. And why did it have to fail? It did not have to particularly fail because of a charismatic leader, by the entry of a charismatic and a very controversial and a polarizing figure like Donald Trump. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the simple fact that this wokeist, this DEI ideology had to fail, because at the end of the day, it was not a people centric ideology, it was an elitist ideology imposed from the top by the elite. And who are the elite we are talking about? The elite which I'm talking about are the political elite in America, the academia elite in the Ivy League colleges of America, the media elite. All these three branches, all these three different streams joined hands to introduce, to almost impose, I would say, this wokeist DEI godless narrative over not only America, but certainly it's going on, as I said, in Europe, but over countries like India also. But eventually it had to fail, because at the end of the day, it was still elitist. It did not enjoy the confidence of the people by and large. Of course, there were many converts to it. A lot of the damage has already been done, but still people had common sense to reject all the, and that's why, to that extent, and that answers the fact that even though Mr. Trump is a very polarizing figure, as we all know, but the fact is he was still ushered in, he was taken, he was brought back, because the people wanted, they had enough of all this nonsense. And to that extent, I would say something similar happened in India also. The similar attempts were made in India, proxy certain opposition parties, certain NGOs, certain groups out there which were desperately trying to impose the same kind of ideology here. And why were they doing that? And the reason for that is very simple. Because what happens in America does not get contained only in America, it spreads all over the world. And that is the influence of America even today in the world, that um, whatever is trending in America, it could be DEI, it could be wokeism, it could be fashion, it could be any kind of trend. That trend has to catch on in the rest of the world. And there were a lot of takers of this kind of philosophy here in India. They tried desperately to impose all this in India also, but all that has failed. Then, as I said, the government of Mr. Modi has took over in June. Um, so both in America and India, to that extent, had this commonality where leaders who opposed this kind of takeover were brought back into power. The danger is certainly not over. It's still very much a part and parcel of life. As I said, in the United Kingdom, it is there in France also, it is there in Germany, it's there in a lot of European countries. Even today, they follow this dictum. the breeding grounds still exist. And the breeding grounds are, what are the breeding grounds? They are the Ivy League colleges of America. And the problem there is not so much as the students, as a lot of people think, oh, they were all with these pro Palestinian marches and all that. The problem is the academia, the lecturers, the assistant professors, the professors, the teaching staff of these universities, all of them, and try and express a divergent opinion in these colleges and universities, and you will be out. You will not find a place there. And in conclusion, I will sum it up for you by giving you a historical example that all this wokist takeover, all this DEI takeover, to that extent, a lot of people think this has been a new phenomena in world affairs. I don't agree with that. I am saying that this is actually a continuation of the old communist takeover, godless communist takeover, which first started in the Soviet Union. I'm going as far back as Lenin and the days of Lenin, Trotsky, and all those figures, when the same kind of commune, communist, there was a new kind of ideology, a godless ideology, which had taken over the Soviet Union. As the irony being that they had shaken off the rule of the czars, who I'm sure must have exploited resources and people. But in the name of that shake off, a new set of rulers, a new set of dictators came into the fore. And so socialism, which thrived in Europe, especially in the 60s and the 70s, as we all know, and then again kind of was not in fashion, has again came back in a different form as DEI, as wokeism in America. The same thing was tried to impose, they tried to impose in India through the back door. But what defeated this entire thing in India, and this is, in conclusion, I'm going to talk a little bit about that before I wind up, is spiritualism, religiosity. That defeated this entire thing in India. And what do I mean by that? Well, all you have to do is to take a look at the Mahakumbh, which is going on in Uttar Pradesh right now. It is unbelievable the number of people who, out of religious faith, out of spiritual belief, are going there to take a dip in the Ganges. The estimation is that almost 40 crore people will take a dip in the Ganges at the Mahakumbh. 40 crore people, which I think roughly translates to what? 400 million people, which is more than the population of the United States. They will take a dip in the Ganges. These are all believers. These are all believers. These are all believers of God, of spirituality. I give this example again and again that India, even today, there are some parts of it we are an emerging economy, but there are parts which are still poor. People still don't have the basic necessities and all that. But even in those common abodes, in the common dwellings, if you go, there might not be enough to eat, there might not be enough to wear, but there will always be a picture of Lord Ram in those dwellings, because that is the faith which carries people forward. So therefore, spirituality, religiosity hasn't really gone away from India. It was under attack from all the same forces which are attacking America, the same forces were at work in India and also, but at least for the time being, they have been stopped in the tracks. The Mahakumbh is expression. It is actually an answer, if you ask me, to all these policies, to all these takeover attempts, to all this perversion, I would say, of the natural order. And I'm repeating my line again that men are back, women are back, the confusion is out, common sense is back. All these things are back. For how long? We don't know, because these forces are in retreat. That is, the negative forces are in retreat right now. But have they been sunk? Have they been completely obliterated? Have they been completely managed? I'm not too sure. They're still very much around. So the battle continues, but at least there is a little bit of a breather right now. There is time to pause and reflect and look forward to the future. A new dawn, a new sense of optimism there. And I'm not particularly talking of what's happening in America only. I'm talking of an entire new global order, where, as I said, Spirituality is the key, especially for us Indians. That is something which has not been able to go down. That is something which is there, which is propelling us forward in the new millennia, in the new age. And so, on this note, I come to the end of this particular podcast. I hope you really liked it. And as I keep repeating again and again, it's so very simple to subscribe to my channel. Just press that red button on your screen, and you become a subscriber free of charge. And so, till next time, it's goodbye and cheers from my end.